In stupid article time, Vanity Fair has written an article saying America has a Supreme Court problem. Wow. Vanity Fair really coming to the rescue over here. Supreme Court actually upholding the Constitution and upholding the law. And Vanity Fair is very, very sad. Hillary Clinton tried warning us. Now what do you do with a rogue court? Wasn't rogue when they were deciding the way that you liked, were they? Wasn't rogue when they made the decisions that you approved of. Now that they're making decisions that, are actually based on the Constitution and text and law, you're like, what do you do with a rogue court? Yeah, you'll only think they're legitimate when they're deciding the way that you like, don't you? Let's read and respond to this stupid Vanity Fair op-ed. This should be fun. A decade ago, the idea that a radical Supreme Court would remake our country might have seemed hyperbolic, but that's exactly what happened. We're off to such a great start over here. The salt is flowing big time. In just the past two turns, the Trumpified Supreme Court, I'm never sure I've ever seen that word before, but that's cool. The Trumpified Supreme Court ended women's constitutional rights to abortion because Roe versus Wade made absolutely no sense at all and was completely unmoored from anything. And they're like, this doesn't make any sense. Limited the state of New York's ability to limit concealed firearms. Second Amendment, right to bear. Struck down affirmative action in college admissions. Equal protection. Blocked Joe Biden's student debt forgiveness plan. Wasn't granted power by the Congress. Acting outside of congressional authority. Squashed the separation of church and state in the school prayer case. Kind of the opposite of that, by the way. So, you can't treat religion worse. See Smith for that proposition, right? You can't treat religion worse. So, if religious people want to be religious, you got to, respect that too. Gutted the Clean Water Act outside of authority. Congress passed a law allowing them to protect waters of the United States, which meant navigatable waters. And, there were no waters to be found at all in Sackett v. EPA. So they just read the words on the page. The waters of the United States, which means navigatable waters, and these aren't those. And backed LGBTQ plus discrimination. Free speech is still important. People have a First Amendment right to not speak. So the Vanity Fair over here is clutching at pearls at all these decisions, which are completely correct. All of them are correct. Every single one. Every single one based off legal principles that make sense, except maybe for the student loan case, because they said that Harvard violates the Equal Protection Clause, which I continue to remain unsure about how that's even hypothetically possible. Harvard violated Title VI, but I'm going to try not to think about it too hard that, that the Supreme Court wrote what it wrote. But other than that, every single decision just based off the law. It's amazing. Wow. This Supreme Court is so deeply emboldened to reshape society that one help can't be relieved when they don't completely shed the Voting Rights Act, or when a majority of justices, though not all of them, reject the fringe right-wing legal theory that could blow up elections in America. That was that independent state legislature case, that the state legislature could act completely alone. And I tended to agree with the majority decision on that one. I don't think that's what the Constitution was talking about. The legislature has the power to determine where the voting districts is, but the legislature only exists to the extent the Constitution creates it. And the Constitution also creates the executive and judicial branches, so there's a role for them in reviewing their own state law, also to the point that the legislature itself can write the law about how those districts are granted, and then the Supreme Court just is doing what the legislature told them to do. So, yeah, but the Vanity Fair completely freaking out over here. Some of us saw this possibility of what a conservative majority could do. But I have to admit, I didn't think Donald Trump would manage to install 3 Supreme Court justices in 4 years. Yeah, that was pretty cool. Some presidents don't get any picks. President Trump picked 3. And at least 2 of them were solid picks. One of them, questionable. But, we'll let you figure out which one it is. Sure, the winner of the November 2016 presidential election would get at least to fill Anthony Scalia's seat, which had been held open since the previous February, as Mitch McConnell blocked President Obama from filling it. During the president debate during Trump and Hillary Clinton in October, moderator Christopher Wallace mused the winner could potentially make 2 or 3 appointments in an effort to determine the balance of the court for what could be the next quarter of the century. So Christopher Wallace saw it coming. You didn't think that they could do it, but Christopher Wallace said, yeah, that seems like a very strong possibility. Yep. The person who really saw this coming that election year and trying to ward voters was Hillary Clinton. Dude, if Hillary Clinton had won the election, can you imagine the Supreme Court as it would now exist? How left-leaning they would be? I mean, it would just be like, it would just be a completely progressive clusterfuck. We came so close to like the most left-leaning court in the history of time. You know, and it is truly amazing how close we came as a country. And we managed to avoid that. It's, I don't know, God's providence or something, but wow. In a Wisconsin speech, she said the Supreme Court was at its best. The court is a place where the least powerful voices in our society are heard and protected, including of those of African Americans fighting for the right to vote, which they have, you know, see, for example, the 15th Amendment, or women demanding abortion rights in the face of humiliating laws that would strip that right away, which isn't based on anything. So far, we've seen the Supreme Court sign off on those humiliating laws. You'll recall the Supreme Court allowed Texas's draconian SB 8, a precursor to Dobbs, to continue. Not strictly speaking, no. They deferred action on it as they took up Dobbs. The Supreme Court really hasn't spoken about SB 8. You know, that's still kind of being fought over in lower courts. That law allowed for bounties and citizen enforcement to restrict abortion. Yes, it did. It was a very interesting and very clever law in a lot of ways, on a technical legal level. Hard to think of a more humiliating law than treating women like criminals when they want to make choices about their own bodies. See, that's the thing, Vanity Fair. That's the thing that's in dispute, that they're making choices about their own bodies. That's the thing, right? So they're not making choices about their own bodies. To the conservatives, they're making choices about someone else's body, namely the child's body. That body doesn't belong to you. It belongs to someone else. That's part of the problem. You are terminating someone else's life. Did they not understand that? They seem to not understand it. The Supreme Court, Clinton said in the final 2016 debate with Trump, really raises the central issue in this election. Namely, Miss Clinton continued, what kind of country are we going to be? What kind of opportunities will we provide for our citizens? What kind of rights will Americans have? And I feel strongly the Supreme Court needs to stand on the side of American people, not on the side of powerful corporations and the wealthy. For me, that means we need a Supreme Court that will stand off on behalf of women's rights, on behalf of the LGBT community, that will stand up and say no to Citizens United. Citizens United was correctly decided. Citizens United was correctly decided. Money does facilitate speech. Restricting money restricts the reach of speech. So Citizens United was correct. A decision that undermined our election system in our country because the way it permits dark, unaccountable money to come into our election system. It was correctly decided. 9 years later, these words pierce the flesh. I do like Vanity's Fair use of like the purple prose and this imagery. I do appreciate the use of imagery and the vivid description. Pierce the flesh. Pierce the flesh, much like an abortionist knife used to pierce the flesh of a innocent child in the womb, one might say, but I digress. Because every June is now an exercise in weighing to see what we've won or lost, or what we're about to lose. A year ago, in their joint Dobbs dissent, Sada Sotomayor, Ellen Kagan, and Justice Breyer wrote in the ruling, breaches a core rule of law principle designed to promote consistency in law. It places in jeopardy other rights, from conception to same-sex intimacy and marriage. And finally, it undermines the court's legitimacy. No, Roe undermined the court's legitimacy. Roe doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't make any sense. It's not based on anything. And it set up this whole trimester framework, which doesn't make any sense. Like, even if you could somehow find the right to an abortion in the Constitution, which good luck. But if you could find the right to an abortion, where they came up with this trimester framework in Roe is beyond me. They came up with a framework that looks a lot more like legislation than a court. Where they come up with this trimester framework? What constitutional provision did they base that on? Sonia Sotomayor warned earlier about oral arguments in Dobbs about how the court's right-wing trajectory could damage the public opinion. Will this institution survive the stench this creates in the public perception that the constitutions and its readings are just political acts, as opposed to what the Supreme Court was doing before? So before, the Supreme Court wasn't doing political. When it was left-leaning, it wasn't doing political. It was doing legal. And now you think it's doing political. Interesting. Turns out the answer was a resounding no, with the Supreme Court being as unpopular as it's ever been. No thanks to the media, who continues to blatantly lie about the Supreme Court, what they do, and completely misunderstands the law. And there are numerous ethical lapses that conservative justices have been accused of. Billionaire Harlan Crow bought Clarence Thomas's mom's house and renovated it. Crow also paid for Thomas's grandnephew to go to private school and took the justice on private jet and yacht trips over the 2 decades. There was also Neil Gorsuch being embroiled in a scandal over the sale of property to the head of a powerful law firm that has argued cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Most recently, Samuel Alito defended his own private jet trip with the laughable excuse that he only occupied a seat, as far as I'm aware, would otherwise have been vacant. Well, they're really clutching at straws, aren't they? They're really unhappy people. Alito decided to get ahead of the scandal by writing an opinion piece in the brainworms-ridden section of, as opposed to Vanity Fair, by the way, which is not brainworms-ridden, but okay. In the brainworms-ridden section of Rupert Murdoch's owned Wall Street Journal editorial page. ProPublica lodged 2 charges against me. First, I should have recused in matters which Andy connected with Paul Singer was a party. And second, that I was obligated to list certain items as gift on my 2008 financial disclosure report. Neither charge is value. Yeah, totally normal behavior for Supreme Court justices. Meanwhile, Chief Justice John Roberts has refused to testify before Congress as it probes Supreme Court ethics issues. As Chief Justice noted in his own letter, the Chief Justice has only testified twice before Congress before, both involving more mundane matters. One that dealt with fundings of the court, so he was providing an opinion sort of, in that capacity, and one dealing with another technical issue. But yeah, he says, I shouldn't testify because this isn't something Chief Justices have done in the past. So I'm going to turn it down because that's not how we roll. So, John Roberts said, yeah, that's not what we do. And seems to think Americans should simply trust the court to fix its own legitimacy mess. But Congress is the body that would, ideally, hold a rogue court in check. Well, Congress is the body that holds the court in check by the approval process in the Senate, the notice and confirmation process of the Senate. So the Senate decides who gets to be on the Supreme Court. That is one of the checks that Congress has on the court in deciding who gets to sit on the court in the first place. So Congress has a check. It's a check of who do you want to have this job? Historically, Congress has exercised an array of powers to hold the court accountable, from exercising more control over the court's docket to taking jurisdiction away over certain cases, to requiring justices to travel around the country. Wow, that's you want to go back to circuit riding. Okay, that's old school. So you want the justices to actually to ride circuit, to go to their respective circuits geographically and circle around in the various courts of appeal, I guess. Or I guess actually the district courts, because it's circuit riding. So you want Supreme Court justices to start hearing cases at the trial level? I mean, I guess they can, but does that seem like the best use of their time? To docking the court's budget, to canceling the court's entire term 1 year. I don't know anything about that. That history escapes me. These powers have constitutional limits, but there's an enormous amount of authority Congress could exercise over the court before it became within a light year of those limits. Yeah. So the Supreme Court, the Congress has the ability to determine, what courts get to hear what kinds of cases, and they've certainly decided in the past the Supreme Court has to hear more cases, and then changed their mind and said, okay, less with that, more discretionary review. And you want to bring back circuit riding, I guess. Okay, that's interesting. As Hillary Clinton predicted, we are now a country that needs protection from our rogue judiciary. Yeah, real rogue over here, doing the job that Article 3 demands after being appointed by the Congress and the president as the Constitution demands in Article 1 and 2. Really, really rogue. Congress can provide this protection, but only if there's a will to. The American people need to continue to pressure our elected officials to hold this extremist and ethically challenged court accountable before it's too late, if it isn't already. Dun, dun, dun. Thus, that brings us to this very sad, full of salt, Vanity Fair op-ed entitled America Has a Supreme Court Problem, in which Molly Young Fast over here learns the truth that the Supreme Court actually upholds the Constitution and actually applies the law as written and doesn't seem to understand what the Supreme Court does and thinks it's illegitimate because they're not getting their way. They're very sad because they saw the Supreme Court merely as a tool to get what they want rather than what the law requires. And now that they're not getting what they want, they're sad, and this must be fixed. The Supreme Court's in crisis. Even though, the Supreme Court is kind of doing exactly what it's always done, but now with justices that are actually kind of based, which is nice for a change. And Hillary Clinton didn't win, and thank God for that. Because could you imagine these court cases if Hillary Clinton had won? Holy shit, dude. We'd have 3 more Ketanji Brown Jacksons on the court. Oof, that'd be intense. So that'd be a dark, dark future, which fortunately didn't happen. And until Vanity understands the Constitution, that brings us to the end of discussion of this story.